You know, when people start seeking greatness for themselves, they fail so many times. In our society today, people want to be famous for so many things, and people want to be famous just for being famous. Because in our society, everyone deserves a trophy. You contrast that with someone like William Wilberforce. He was a politician in England, and he was confronted with the horrors of the slave trade in 1787. And for the next 60 years, he fought against that practice in Britain. And finally, in 1833, a bill was passed that abolished slavery in Britain. 3 days later, William died. The reason he spent 60 years on that cause was because he had a desire to put his Christian principles into action and to serve God in public life. You know, as a follower of Jesus Christ, we should seek greatness also. We should seek greatness for God's kingdom. And that's what Jesus tells us in Mark chapter 9. And we're going to look at what he talks to his disciples about this morning. And so if you have a Bible, turn to Mark chapter 9. If you don't have a Bible, there should be one of the chairs in front of you. It's page 715. You can find it on your phone or tablet pretty easily. Or if you have your own Bible, Matthew's kind of toward the end of the Bible, right after the book of Matthew and then Mark, right before Luke. Mark chapter 9, what's happening here is Jesus is in the middle of his ministry. Some of the greatest days of his ministry are happening, and he's traveling with his disciples, and an incident happens, and he starts talking about being great in his kingdom. And the first thing we'll learn this morning is that you need to desire to be great in God's kingdom. Desire to be great in God's kingdom. Mark 9, starting with verse 33. They, Jesus and his disciples, they came to Capernaum. When he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the road?" But they kept quiet because on the way they had argued about who was the greatest. Sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, "If anyone wants to be first, he must be the very last and the servant of all." So Jesus and his disciples are on the road to Capernaum. As they're going along, they're arguing. The disciples are arguing about who is the greatest in God's kingdom. And the Bible doesn't tell us, but I'm picturing the argument going something like this. Peter says, "Well, obviously I'm the greatest. I walked on water." And Andrew says, "Well, that's true, Peter, but you wouldn't have even been here if I wouldn't have invited you. And by the way, you sank." Nathaniel says, "Well, Jesus said about me, there's nothing false in this guy. I mean, he's just a genuine person." Matthew says, "Yeah, but I threw a party and Jesus came." Judas says, "Well, he let me keep the money. I'm the treasurer. Obviously, I'm the most important." And John just sets them all to the side and says, "Well, you know what? I'm the disciple that Jesus loves. So you all lose." And as they're arguing, fighting on the road, they get there, and Jesus says, "All right, what's going on? You guys are fighting on the road. What's happening?" And he confronts them about that. And the disciples were quiet. I can just picture him saying, "Man, I didn't say nothing. I don't know what's going on. Peter, it was Peter. He's the one that said everything." You know how he's always putting his foot in his mouth. And so Jesus talks to them about greatness. You notice he doesn't say, "Don't seek greatness." He says, "Do it, but just do it in the right way." You see, as people, we want to accomplish great things. We want to stand out. We want to be remembered. And that's fine if you have the right motivation. The Apostle Paul had a desire to make a difference for Jesus. In Romans chapter 15, Paul writes, and he says this. He says, "It has always been my ambition to preach the gospel where Christ was not known, so that I would not be building on someone else's foundation." Paul says, I have an ambition. And the word there means to earnestly aspire to something. Paul says, man, I've got this driving force in my life. I'm seeking after this ambition. I want to preach Christ where no one else has. And Paul not only had that ambition, but he encouraged it in other people. When he wrote his letter to Timothy, he wrote and said, hey, whoever desires to be an elder, whoever desires that position in the church, whoever desires to be an elder, desires a noble task. And the word desires there is the word, it means to stretch out in order to grasp. It's where you can just see someone striving to reach something. And Paul says to be that type of leader in the church, that's a great desire. That's a very honorable one. And so have those type of ambitions, have those type of desires for the church, for God's kingdom. Oswald Sanders was a preacher a couple centuries ago. He said, ambition that centers on the glory of God and the welfare of the church is a mighty force for good. I think as followers of Jesus Christ, we should have ambition for God's kingdom. I think that's just a part of what it should be. And how that plays out in any one person's life, man, there's just so many ways that could work out. Because God has made us different. He's given us unique gifts and talents and abilities to seek after his kingdom in different ways. Maybe it's getting rid of sex trafficking in Phoenix. Maybe it's bringing hope to people on the Indian reservation. Maybe it's showing people that are close to here that there is a purpose in life. Maybe it's being a church that is impacting the lives of future generations of people. Maybe for you, it's at your workplace. You say, you know what? I want to bring a Christian influence into this workplace. Whatever it is, we should have a godly ambition, an ambition that seeks to grasp things for God's kingdom. The disciples were arguing about who was the greatest. And Jesus said, hey, let's change this conversation. The desire to be great in God's kingdom is what you need to be pursuing. And then he told them how to do it. He said, first of all, you need to humble yourself to be great in God's kingdom. You need to humble yourself to be great in God's kingdom. There in verse 36, he took a little child and had him stand among them. Taking him in his arms, he said to them, whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me. Jesus is talking to the disciples. He's saying, okay, you guys are fighting. You're fighting about being the greatest. Here's a kid. Now, I don't know where the kid came from. I don't know if Jesus just zapped him into being or something. I don't know. It doesn't say this kid was there or the kid was there and while Jesus is lecturing the disciples. But whatever way, Jesus finds this kid and he's there and he sets him in front of him and you can just kind of see him hugging him, putting his arms around him, sitting on his lap and then talking to the disciples about what it means to be great. He says, whoever welcomes this kid, whoever sees this kid as being important. Do you remember at holidays being a kid and there was the adult table and then there was the kids table over there? And the kids table was just over on the side because the kids are not as important as the adults. And so do you ever remember getting to go from the kids table and then graduating to the adult table? And you're thinking it's going to be all that and you get there and it's like, this is it? I mean, they're just eating the same food, only they're talking about stuff that's boring. I want to go play. But the idea is so many times we see kids as just not that important and we just kind of dismiss them. We ignore them. We don't pay a lot of attention to them. Jesus says you can't think more of yourself than you do other people. You need to have a humble attitude. Daniel Norris is a pitcher for the Toronto Blue Jays. He signed a $2 million signing bonus. $2 million. That's what they gave him just to show up. And so Daniel Norris wanted to make sure that he didn't get a big head. And so he bought this van and lives in this van in the off season. All his clothes are in there. He cooks from the van. That's where he sleeps. It's just in a parking lot of a store. That's where he lives. Because he said, I don't want to get caught up in the trappings of success. I want to make sure I stay grounded. And so he humbles himself. And there's just a huge article in Sports Illustrated about him recently. No one likes people who are cocky and arrogant, whether they're celebrities or just normal people. And that's good, because James says in James 4, he says, humble yourselves before the Lord and he will lift you up. You should have a humble attitude instead of thinking that you're all that. When people get a part of fame, when they start to become famous, it's easy for them to get a big head and start forgetting about all those common people that are there. And we have names for those people. The people that act like that, we call them jerks, we call them stuck up, we call them snobs. But I wonder if we do the same thing. Do we look at other people in our everyday life and just think, they're beneath me? I think sometimes we look at people and say, well, they're too old. Those old people, they're just too old. They don't have anything to offer. But I think we also do the same thing with young people. We think, well, they're young people. They don't know enough. They can't really add anything to my life. Sometimes we walk past people that don't have a lot. They're very poor. We walk past them and worse than thinking bad thoughts about them, we just think nothing of them. But I think we also have attitudes about people who are too rich. If people have significantly more money than I do, well, then they're arrogant, they're greedy. I mean, they wouldn't be rich if they weren't greedy. And we dismiss them. Sometimes it's about intelligence, Some people we talk and say, man, their elevator does not go all the way to the top. But if someone's too smart, well, then they're just prideful and they're snobs. And what happens is we come in contact with people all the time, and anyone that is just barely outside of where we are, we're too good for them. And we would never say those words out loud, but that's the attitude that comes across. And we tend to find something wrong with everybody else out there so we can see ourselves in a better light. And Jesus condemns that attitude. He says that's not the attitude as a follower of Christ that we should have. We should see every person out there as being different, but we're not better than them. God loved us all. Jesus died for every single person's sins. He thought that we were all important enough to die for. God loves each and every one of us. Now, he may disagree with things that we do or say. All right, that happens. But he loves us all because we're all his creation. And so when we have an attitude where we're above someone else, that's something we got to get rid of. And that's what the disciples were doing. They were trying to say, hey, I'm better than the other disciples, so I'm better than them. And Jesus said, hey, see this kid? Man, we're on the same page. Humble yourself to be great in God's kingdom. And then the other thing that Jesus says in this subject is, he says, put others first to be great in God's kingdom. Humble yourself is about your attitude. Putting others first is about your actions. Turn over a page in your Bible to chapter 10, verse 35. It says this. It says, then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. Teacher, they said, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. What do you want me to do for you? He asked. They replied, let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory. And skip down to verse 41. When the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John. Jesus called them together and said, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Man, there's just so much in this passage. Okay, so the first thing happened with the kid. That happened about 6 months ago. So about 6 months later, James and John, they did learn something. The first time, instead of arguing with everyone, they're like, oh, that didn't work. So they pulled Jesus aside privately and say, hey, Jesus, we see that you're going to be a king. And so when you get into your kingdom, here's what we want. I want to sit at your right hand, and my brother wants to sit at your left. I want to be the prime minister. My brother wants to be secretary of state. Let us have those positions. And Jesus is like, seriously? Haven't we been through this? And he goes and talks to them about their attitude and about being a servant. Now, see, I love that. I love the fact that these disciples of Jesus who spent all this time with him, they're in the presence of God. I love the fact that they didn't get it the first time. Because I know that in my life, I don't always get things the first time. There have been things that have happened in my life, and it's like time after time after time after time, and I still don't get it. And it's like, wow, when the disciples don't get it, all right, well, I'm not alone in my cluelessness. That's a good thing. Beyond that, though, Jesus says, if you want to be great, awesome. Again, here's what you do in my kingdom. In my kingdom, you become the servant. See, in the world, he says, the Gentiles lord it over them. It's all about power and authority. It's all about the position. And we see the pyramid, right? And the pyramid is the guy at the top, all these people down here, their job is to make his life better. But Jesus says in his kingdom, that pyramid gets turned upside down. And the person that's in charge, their job is to serve everybody else. Their job is to make everybody else better. Oswald Sanders said it like this: true greatness, true leadership is found in giving yourself in service to others. It's about being a servant. You know, so many times we are self-centered. We develop relationships, or we go to work and we try to promote ourselves. We try to make everything about us, and how do I get higher? And Jesus says, if you want to be great in my kingdom, your actions need to be about, how do I make everyone else around me better? The world says when you're in charge, you're the boss. Others are there to serve you. You exert authority, you have power, force, threats. God's kingdom, you help others grow and succeed. When you do this, that's how you become great in God's kingdom. Don Wilson is the senior minister at Christ Church of the Valley. Here in the Valley, there are about 25,000 people that go to church at one of their campuses every weekend. That's a big church. And a church like that, one of the things that Don teaches is this. He says, as a leader, you are the example and not the exception. That's what he teaches to his people all the time. If you're on staff there, if you're in a leadership position, you're the example and not the exception. Not only does he teach it to his people, but he lives it out. I was at a church conference there just a couple of weeks ago, and he was getting ready to speak, and before he was getting ready to speak, he was going from table to table and handing out notes about what he was about to talk about. And I heard someone ask him, they said, "Hey, Don, what are you doing? Don't you have someone that can handle all those things out for you?" And he said, if you're the leader, you're the example and not the exception. You know, later that day, we were walking from one place to another outside on the campus, and he saw a piece of trash, bent down, picked it up, and threw it away. Not a big deal, other than when you realize how big that campus is, they've got a whole bunch of full-time people whose job is to make the place look good. But it's about setting that example. It's about setting the example for people and seeing the needs that are there and serving. You know, it's the exact same thing that Jesus taught us. In John chapter 13, Jesus on his last day on the earth, he's getting ready the next day to go through the crucifixion and all those things. But John 13 tells us about his last night with his disciples. It says it was just before the Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Jesus knew this is it. So having loved his own, his disciples, having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. The evening meal was being served. The devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So they're at the meal, and Jesus realizes, he knows that all the power has been given him. All authority has been given him by God. So, in verse 4, he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with a towel that was wrapped around him. You need to understand the Jewish culture. In the Jewish culture, they would walk around town, and they would do it in their sandals. And a lot of times, the roads were kind of dusty. And a lot of times, the roads had animals on them, and the animals left behind presents that animals leave behind when they're out. And so people would walk in the dust and the grime and the grit and all that stuff. And when they would go to someone's house to eat, they wouldn't sit at chairs and a table. Most of the time, their tables were like about this high. And they would kind of recline at them. They'd kind of lean over on one elbow, and their feet would be sticking out here. Well, there's another guest sitting about right there. And so if my feet are all nappy and the right guy by his nose and he's trying to eat, that's just not a great thing. And so most places had a servant who, when you first came in the house, they'd wash your feet to get all the stuff off, so when you're eating, it doesn't stink up the place. Well, for whatever reason, we're not told, for whatever reason, there wasn't a servant there at this meal. I don't know if they got detained. I don't know if they got busy. I don't know if they forgot what's going on. But they're getting ready they've sat down. They've leaned over at the meal. And Jesus gets up and he goes and washes the disciples' feet. Because their feet were dirty. Because it's something that needed to be done. Because he was showing them how much he loved them. Because it's about serving other people. Our humble attitude says, people, I'm not better than anyone else. Our actions say, I'm going to invest in other people's lives. I'm going to do what I can to help other people grow closer to God. Sometimes it's physical. Sometimes you hear about someone that's moving, so you go help them. Or sometimes you're appreciative of someone, and so you make them something and you give it to them. Sometimes you serve other people by encouraging. There's a lot of times that people just get overwhelmed with life. And when you come beside them and say, hey, you know what? I know that you're going through this stuff, but man, I'm with you. I say, you just say, I believe in you. I believe that you're going to make it through this situation. God is on your side, and he's not going to leave you hanging. And you can be a great encourager. Sometimes you can be a trainer. You can teach other people things that you've learned. If you've been in a job for a while, you've got wisdom from experience, from mistakes that you've made. And as other people are new to your job, you can help teach and train them and help them succeed. See, that's just the opposite of the world's philosophy. I heard a coach one time was teaching and said about this person, he said, I don't want to teach that person. Because if I teach them, I'm afraid that they're going to get a little bit better and they'll be able to beat me. And since I don't want them to beat me, I don't want to teach them any new skills. I'm like, man, that's so the world's attitude. But as followers of Jesus Christ, that's not the attitude that we should have. Instead, we need to put others first to be great in God's kingdom. Seeking greatness in God's kingdom, that's encouraged. That's encouraged in the Bible. That's encouraged by Jesus. He says, hey, if you want to do it, this is how. Don't think more highly of yourself than you ought to. And make sure you put other people first. That you go and serve them. You help them to get better. That's what he's called us to do. William Wilberforce was the politician who helped end slavery in Britain. But there was another man who was just as important, but almost nobody remembers him. His name was Thomas Clarkson. And instead of trying to go through the government to end slavery, he decided to take a different route, and he was going to go work on people. He was going to try and convince people and work through them to get them to make the decision to go against slavery. And so he spent the same 60 years that William did. He spent 60 years going from town to town in Britain, and he would go there and he would talk to them about slavery and how awful it was, and he gave them something to do. He put together small groups of people who were against slavery so that they could talk in their town. He never made himself the leader of any of those groups. His job was to start the group, make sure it was running, and he would go to the next town and do the same thing. His name has been all but forgotten in history. But God knows who he is. God knows what he did and why he did it. And as much as William Wilberforce did, Thomas Clarkson did at least as much in helping to get rid of slavery in Britain. In the same way, Jesus came to this earth. And Jesus came to this earth and started a movement. And honestly, in 3 years, Jesus was able to walk with his disciples and teach them and talk with them. He started a movement that's lasted 2,000 years and has spread throughout the entire globe. And the movement is based on just a pretty simple premise that we're people and that we're messed up. And we need someone to help us because we can't do it on our own. And Jesus talked about a God who loved us so much that he sent his son to die in our place, to serve us. And if we want to go to heaven, man, that's great. We just need to do it the way that God told us to do. That's by believing and following his son, Jesus Christ. And so this morning, if you are already a follower of Christ, the message for you is this. Seek greatness in God's kingdom. Seek to do something more than just denting your couch and wearing out your remote control. Seek something great in God's kingdom. And you do that by having a humble attitude and a servant heart. And if you're not a follower, then you need to talk to someone about how to begin that relationship. Either way, if you want to talk to someone about your walk with God, we're going to be available after this song. So I just ask that you would all stand up. And if you need to talk to someone about your walk with God, why don't you come meet me up front as we sing this song.